Plywood sometimes gets a bad rap from fine woodworkers, but I think it's an excellent material to build with, especially when you are just starting out. And I use plywood in a lot of my projects, in furniture, in workshop projects, to build cabinets, and also in a lot of home improvement projects. And plywood actually has a lot of advantages. Number one, it's super strong, at least compared to other softwoods. Number two, it's very stable with changes in temperature or humidity. And number three, it is much cheaper than corresponding options for softwoods or hardwoods. I mean, imagine being able to buy a huge 40-inch wide board in hardwood. That's pretty much impossible. However, when you are just starting out and you walk into that aisle with all of that plywood around you, it can feel really overwhelming. So today we're going to break down everything you need to know about plywood. But before we get started, if you are new here, I am Annika and I am here to demystify DIY and inspire and empower you to build all of the things. Now, let's get started. So what exactly is plywood and how is it made? Plywood is actually a combination of wood veneers and a binder or a glue. The way it's made is that veneer sheets are laid on top of each other with their grains perpendicular to each other. So you have one veneer going this way and then the grain of the other veneer goes this way and more and more. And once all of that is put together with glue in between each of the veneers and then it's compressed down and you get your plywood. Now, because of the way it is built with each of those veneers, the resulting plywood is much stronger than solid wood of the same size. And because the veneers on each layer are perpendicular to each other, they counteract the movement. And that gives us a board that is dimensionally stable, much more dimensionally stable than any of the hardwoods or 2x4s. So essentially a plywood is made up of three parts. Number one, you have the core layers, which are the body of the plywood. And then you have the front face, which is expected to be exposed in the project. And you have a back face, which is expected to be hidden in the projects. Now, if you look closely, you will notice that the front and the back veneers are really thin. And this is almost always the case, which is why anytime you are sanding a piece of plywood, you want to be really careful because you don't want to go through that top veneer. Now, when you walk into a home improvement store or any lumber store to buy plywood, it can feel really overwhelming because there's all these numbers and nomenclatures that you have to figure out. So I'm going to break all of that down for you, but I do have a printable guide, a quick reference guide that you can print out and save and keep with you that you can get with the link in the description below. Now, the number one thing with plywood is the number of plies. So you often hear terms like 3-ply, 5-ply, 7-ply, 11-ply, etc. So plies are essentially the number of veneers that make up that plywood. Now, you will always have an odd number of veneers or odd number of plies because the front and the back face are oriented in the same direction because it needs to balance out the board. Also, it kind of looks better if you have the grain on your sheet of plywood on the same direction on both sides. But more importantly, the reason is to balance out the panel. Now, the same thickness of plywood can have a different number of plies. Let me show you. Now, both of these plywoods are 3/4 inch thick. However, you can very clearly see the difference in the number of plies. This one here is a 7-ply, so there are 5 plies inside, 2 outer faces. This one here is 11-ply, so there are 9 plies inside and 2 outer faces. Now, because they are the same thickness, the panel with the larger number of plies is going to have thinner veneers in the core, which means that it also has a lot more glue in there, and that makes that panel much more sturdier and stronger than the panel with the 5 plies. Also, as you increase the number of veneers, the voids and the gaps decreases. And you will notice that this right here, this is the 7-ply plywood, actually has voids in there, which is very common. You will commonly see these voids in a lot of the 7-ply plywoods, which is fine. It is great for using for building furniture, for building workshop projects or cabinets where the edges are not going to be exposed. However, if you wanted to leave the edges of the plywood exposed and showcase them, which to be honest, plywood edges, exposed plywood edges have their own special characteristic, and you can incorporate that and make that a part of your project, then in that case you want to probably use a 11-ply plywood like the Baltic birch, etc. Another example of the application is also patterned plywood, where you're creating patterns with thin pieces of plywood. Now, the next thing that you want to look for when you are buying plywood is the type of plywood that you want to get for your particular application. So there are a bunch of different types of plywood. The first type is called structural plywood or construction plywood, and it's also called sheathing plywood. And this plywood is specifically made to be strong and sturdy, and it's graded for structural applications like building and construction. It is made to be as strong as possible. However, it is also made to be covered up, so the top veneers are not always pretty to look at, and they have knots and voids, etc. So I don't recommend using those for your furniture projects. However, I have used this type of plywood in projects where I am covering it up, like a bench top that I upholster. Another common type of plywood that you will come across in home improvement stores especially is sanded plywood. Now, this plywood is pretty budget friendly. However, it can take a little bit of work to make it look good. The outer veneers of sanded plywood are made up of softwood veneers, so they're pretty easy to dent, and I do not recommend this for building furniture or tabletops, etc. However, that said, if you don't have a choice and if that's the only option available, you could probably use it. I did use it to build my daughter's A-frame desk, which took a little bit of work to get the top nice and smooth and ready to paint and nice and strong, and it has lasted pretty well for 4 years. So it can take a little bit of work, but if you don't have any other option, you can totally use it. However, what I highly recommend using are hardwood plywoods. So hardwood plywood is when the outer veneers are made up of gorgeous hardwood veneers. So this one here, for example, is birch plywood, and birch is my go-to when I am painting the project. But if you intend on leaving the plywood visible, then you want to use something like oak or maple or walnut, and just let the plywood or the veneer of the plywood shine through. Another option is, if you are building cabinets, you can actually get pre-finished plywood. So this plywood right here is birch plywood, but it is lacquered, so it's got a finish on the plywood itself. So this makes for really great cabinets, because then the inside of the cabinet is already finished and wipeable, and you don't have to worry about finishing that. Now, one other nomenclature you will very often hear about plywoods are the plywood grades. So you'll hear something like AB plywood. And what this means is that the grade signifies the quality of the veneer, the outer veneers, the front and the back face. Now, you always want a higher grade veneer plywood for aesthetics and projects where the plywood is going to be visible, or a lower grade plywood would be okay to use for something like a structural application. There can be situations where you have a plywood where the front and the back have different grades. So for example, you look at this plywood. This is nice and clean. It has a little tiny spot here, but the back has a bunch of knots that were filled in, etc. So the front is a higher grade and the back is a lower grade. So the front faces are usually signified with a letter grade, and they start with A grade, which is absolutely smooth with no defects or knots present, and it goes down to B, C, and D. As you go down the grades, more and more knots, etc. are present, and D grade is basically construction plywood, which has a bunch of knots and defects. And the same goes with the back grades as well, where the back grades are signified with numbers. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and the same way 1 is perfect, no knots, no defects, and 4 is lots of knots and defects. And once again, I have that plywood guide that's linked in the description below, which has tables that tell you everything with all the descriptions for all the grades, thicknesses, plies, etc. So definitely grab that. And even though the front face is signified by a letter and the back face is signified by a number, sometimes you can find plywood that have a letter for both the faces. So you can have that A, B grade plywood. Now let's talk about plywood sizes. So we're going to talk about the dimensions as well as the thicknesses. Now plywood sheets are typically found in 4 foot by 8 foot sheets, which are called full sheets. So when you hear someone say full sheet, that means a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet. Now you can also have a half sheet, which is 4 foot by 4 foot, or you can have a quarter sheet, which is 4 feet by 2 feet. And some plywoods like Baltic birch also are available in 5 foot by 5 foot sheets. And also there are utility plywoods that can be found in 4 foot by 10 foot sheets. But for all practical purposes, for all of our purposes, for building projects, furniture, and home improvement projects, a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet is probably what you're looking for. But if you have a project that does not need all of that plywood, you don't have space to store the extra plywood, and you want to transport it easily, you can always buy the 2 foot by 4 foot sheet or even the 4 foot by 4 foot sheet. In terms of the thickness, 3/4 inch plywood is the most common thickness, but you can also find 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, and 1/8 inch plywood very easily in most home improvement stores. However, just like dimensional lumber, plywood thickness isn't always what is noted on the tag. There is a nominal thickness and an actual thickness. Because of the way that plywood is manufactured, you can get a thickness that is lower by about a 16 to an 1/8 of an inch. So you always want to make sure that you measure the thickness of your plywood before you start using it in your projects. Now the thickness isn't always off. Sometimes you will get a 3/4 inch thick plywood. It depends on the brand, it depends on the grade. Baltic birch plywood is almost always exactly 3/4 inches. I do buy plywood from a local dealer where I do get 3/4 inch thick plywood. So you always definitely want to measure your plywood, make sure you're taking into account any variations. Now, one of the questions I get a lot of times is, how exactly do you get a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet of plywood home? If you don't have a pickup truck, which I don't, I only have an SUV and it does not fit a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet of plywood. The best thing to do in that case is, number one, you get the plywood cut down at the store. Most stores will cut it down for you. You have to just let them know at what width or length you want it cut down. And what I usually do is I pick a dimension that is about, say, a couple inches more than what I need, because I know that I cannot expect the store to be extremely accurate. So I have them cut down about a couple inches bigger than what I need, and then I bring it home and I cut it down. And yes, there is a little bit of wastage in that process, but at least I'm able to get the boards home. Now, in cases where you do need a full length of plywood, like for example, when I was building the closet organizers, I needed the whole 8 foot sheet of plywood. So I just rented a truck. I rented a truck from Home Depot. It's about $19 an hour. I live about 4 miles away. So I pretty much got the truck, got the plywood, dropped it off home, dropped the truck back within about half an hour, 45 minutes. So it was just $20, which is much less than what I would have to pay if I were to buy a pickup truck and pay for insurance and all of that stuff and take care of it. So you could rent it from Home Depot, you could rent it from U-Haul. I'm sure you can find places to rent or ask a friend for a favor. That is it about plywoods, but before we go, we're going to have a quick chat about other non-plywood sheet goods, which are very common and can be confusing and can sometimes be used in place of plywood as well, depending on the application. So the first one is MDF, which is medium density fiberboard. MDF is made up of resin and wood glue and shredded wood fibers. So instead of wood veneers, you've got shredded wood fibers and they are compressed to make MDF. So MDF is extremely heavy, much heavier than a sheet of plywood. It does not have any grain pattern on it, so you obviously cannot use it to stain. It does make a good candidate for painting, but you do have to make sure that you prime it really well because those fibers just drink up the paint. You can also get MDF with nice veneer on top. So you can have wood veneer, you can have a white veneer, which is often used in closets and mass manufactured furniture. The great thing is that the way MDF is manufactured, it removes all of the moisture from the process. So it's extremely flat and extremely stable. However, it can absorb moisture and swell up. So you really don't want to use it in high moisture areas like kitchens or bathrooms. The other type of sheet good that is very commonly found is hardboards. And hardboards are also called high density fiberboards, and they're made pretty much like the MDF is made, but it does use much higher pressure and temperature to really compress it down, which results in a board that is resistant to warping and bending and cracking, and it's really stiff and dimensionally stable. Now, hardwood can be found with one side smooth and the other side rough, or both sides smooth. You can even find it coated with melamine, which can actually be used as whiteboard. One of the ways that I use hardboards is as an alternative to 1/4-inch plywood. So I use it as the bottom of drawers or the back of bookcases, etc. Now let's talk about particle board, because particle board furniture is very commonly found in all the mass-produced furniture stores. So particle boards are essentially wood chips that are mixed with resin and glue and compressed, and they are much cheaper than typical plywood, and they have a much lower density compared to MDF and plywood, so they're much lighter. And you can create different surfaces on the particle board depending on your application. So you can have a smooth surface, you can have a nice veneer on top, a laminate surface, so it just depends on your application. Of course, they are more prone to damage, they're more prone to moisture, and they don't really hold screws or fasteners very well. I definitely do not recommend using them for projects. So that is everything you need to know to be able to pick the right plywood or sheet good for your project. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time.